Hello. Since we're not meeting today, I will review lecture activities uh, and explain more about Project One. So we'll discuss all the stuff that you see on the screen today, especially to help you prep for your Project One rough draft. Did I skip ahead? Yes, I did. So we'll discuss all of this. You don't have to read all of those short stories. Um, but of course, choose one of the short stories from this week to complete your journal. We'll also talk about rough draft stuff, particularly prepping your introduction. Now let's talk about this. Perspective. Consider what it's like to immerse yourself in a perspective you've never thought of before. Does a certain perspective make literature great? Just some questions to mull over. For this class, when we're talking about perspective, I'm going to talk about these three things. Perspective is open-ended. It can mean a lot of different things, but for this lecture, for this class, this is what I mean. In certain stories, the same story can be told from multiple perspectives so that we're tracing across the same narrative, but we're slipping on different sunglasses to view it in a different light. For example, I've probably mentioned this in class, one of my favorite stories. In Broken Monsters, the city of Chicago is narrated and navigated in different ways by several central characters. We see the city and this murder mystery through the lens of a video blogger journalist. We see it from a Latina detective. We see it from her teenage daughter who's obsessed with catfishing people online for laughs. We see it from the eyes of the murderer. Similarly, in the story In a Bamboo Grove, can also be translated to In the Grove or In a Grove. The preceding events unfurl in a series of testimonies, first by passersby, an auxiliary policeman, and a relative, and then we get the viewpoint of the three main protagonists, the samurai, his wife, and the bandit. But the truth, what really happened, remains hidden due to the contradicting accounts that are given. So what does it matter if we understand or see a story from different viewpoints? Consider that question for yourself. If I were to answer the question, I think that when characters narrate the same story, different characters, it allows for multi layers of meaning so that we can understand how one thing is not just one thing or something is not so simple. And maybe it helps us understand ourselves and other people a little bit better. There are, of course, other stories where one narrator shares their worldview. We still can maybe gain some insight into this one perspective and how it differs from our own. Adichie's short stories often tell the tales of characters struggling to find a sense of identity while living in Nigeria or America, More specifically, she explores themes of war and power in the short story, The American Embassy. So during the event of this story, the audience sees events unfold from one viewpoint. We see what the main character sees. And in a similar fashion, we see this one perspective in the video, The Art of Asking. When was the last time that you asked for something? And what does it mean when you ask for something? While describing this, The Art of Asking, Amanda Palmer describes it as a process and how she grappled with the humility in asking. Why does asking for something, particularly money or for a favor, why does it seem so scary? If you're thinking about these questions on your own, great. I'll answer this question in my own way. So when asking for something bigger, I think it's scary because it creates a vulnerability, and we don't even realize how this putting ourselves out there can be turned into a strength. And that's part of why I like that Amanda Palmer video and her perspective on asking. So if you do end up watching the video, you can choose to write some sentences about it. You don't have to. You don't have to bring it to class and submit to me your 2 sentences. But I thought it was worth mentioning only because when you quote from a video, it's a little bit different than quoting from a book. Obviously, instead of using page numbers, you would supplement instead with a timestamp for the quote or paraphrase from the video. And that's for MLA or APA, as you see from the example on the screen, even though it's APA, you would still cite a timestamp for MLA. So moving on to project 1 and the first part of it, your introduction. And even though your P1 essay has to feature an introduction, 2 main subsections, and a conclusion, you don't have to write any of this in order. Like thinking, writing's not always a linear process, and it's okay to start in the middle. Perhaps you're going to start drafting your main points, and then you go back later, you finish the conclusion, and you realize that reads more like my introduction. So you shift it around and you make it work for you. However, this lecture is going to review the project 1 draft from the start, the introduction, even if you choose to write that part last, which is fine. So on the screen, we have 3 student sample introductions for project 1, the My Perspective essay. And each of these introductions takes a different approach to starting off that essay. However, what they all do well is that they end the introduction with a clear thesis statement. We can see the title of their stories in the statement and the 2 subtopics they plan on reviewing. We can also see from these statements, the thesis, that they have a perspective on one element of their chosen story. Really, this essay is only about 2 things. You choose one story element to focus on, and then you offer your perspective or your opinion about that element. If you're still confused on what your perspective could add to this essay, you have so many options. I've put a few options on the screen, a lot of them posed as questions. I do want you to put something of yourself in this essay if possible, or again, just your opinion. You're discussing and explaining more about that story element and why it matters or why it's good or bad or reflects something personal about yourself or something about reality or culture or whatever you come up with is fine. Now that you're more confident about the parts of Project One overall, let's go back to drafting your introduction. So when developing that introduction, there's parts of an intro, of an effective intro, as you see on the screen. We'll discuss what they mean and how to use them. So your hook, start with grabbing the reader's attention. Types of hooks or ways to get the reader's attention can be seen on the screen, and we're going to move through each of these. So with imagine, use that word to start your hook, to start your introduction. Place the audience in someone else's shoes and have them imagine being in that situation that you're describing. With an anecdote, less is more. Honestly, for any type of writing, less is more, but it's okay to relate a brief story in 1 or 2 sentences to hook your reader in, especially if that story is relevant to what you're about to talk about. Or you can hook your reader in with a relevant quote or startling fact that relates somehow to your story. After your hook or your attention getter, you still need a bridge. This is essentially a filler sentence to bridge the reader from your hook to your thesis statement, because without it, your introduction is going to read really oddly. It's just going to grab their attention, yeah, and then drive the reader off a cliff to here's my thesis, here's what I'm doing. It won't make sense. I've seen many an introduction with a great attention getter, a succinct thesis, but no bridge. So examples of bridge statements are on the screen. They're in bold. So I showed you examples of different kinds of hooks. And to follow up from that hook, to bridge it to the rest of your introduction, we see examples on the screen, ways to bring clarity and reasoning for your attention getter, why that attention getter, why that hook matters to your premise, to the story that you're going to speak about. Lastly, you have your hook, you have your bridge, and then you need your thesis statement. We already talked about this, talked about how a thesis statement can have its own formula. It really just tells the audience what you're after. You want them to know what you're after from the start. And again, we already practiced it, so I hope this part is a little bit easier for you. And then your thesis is that organizational promise. The order that you list your subtopics in your thesis should be the order of the subtopics in your paper. If you keep this order, and you should, your ideas will seem more brilliant than they could have been, because someone who is organized, seeming like they have everything all together, everyone will read or take what you say with more credibility. I suggest practicing your intro paragraph using the formula as we discussed: a hook, bridge, then your thesis statement. You can put some filler stuff in between there if you want, but following this basic formula will organize your ideas so you can fully develop them. Lecture password. This lecture is optional. However, if you include the correct lecture password, what you see on the screen, Carmen Berzatto, a character from an amazing show, The Bear, which we'll review later in this semester. You include this lecture password at the top or bottom of your P1 rough draft essay. It'll earn you up to 2 extra credit points on that assignment. Throughout this course, I'll often refer to a formula or a template to help you write. Template consists of writing expectations for a document, helps you align what you're thinking of writing with what's expected from the audience or the receiver. Oftentimes, writing requires you to express yourself while tailoring the message to appeal to others. Effective writers do more than just write sentences. They map their sentences in an organized way to appeal to the audience. Writing is a series of moves. Seasoned writers seem to complete these moves easily. It seems like they're born with it right, but it's only because they memorize templates. They know how to adjust the templates as they see fit. For newer and seasoned writers, templates can act as an instructional tool. Templates can help you become more creative, not less. For instance, Shakespeare didn't invent sonnets, but he wrote them well. Songwriters rely on verse, chorus, verse patterns. Screenwriters adhere to formatting conventions to create scripts. Sports players, they have to learn the rules before they're participating. My kids play basketball, they participate in track. They need to learn the rules before they can be ultra creative in these sports. Templates will be provided for most assignments if you haven't already figured that out, and it can take different forms. For some assignments, you'll see part of the guidelines. You can follow one step at a time. For others, you'll have a student sample that sets somewhat of a tone for a template you can follow without copying the wording or the images. Other assignments will feature an outline to follow, or what you might call a template, to create the draft of your document. Essentially, templates show what came before, and it can help you start writing. This can establish confidence for writers who may have not encountered a particular format before, and it lends seasoned writers validation that they've been following what's expected for certain writing conventions. In the world of academic writing, templates will not always be provided. However, as you're still learning the expectations of this type of writing, I will provide templates when I can to ensure your confidence grows and you can manipulate these set forms as a seasoned writer as we go along. There's even a template to follow for the P1 rough draft. You find it in the assignment guidelines. It features a basic outline of the draft and other instructions to adhere to. Please reach out with questions about this before Sunday if you have them. Before submitting your essay, review the rubric. You find that by going into the assignment guidelines and clicking how I will grade the assignment. This rubric features yes or no questions to self-review your work against. I also use these rubric topics to grade your essay, as you'll see point breakdowns next to each bolded topic. Next week is poetry week, but it's also peer review week. Print out your draft and have it ready for Tuesday's peer review activities. If you don't show up to class, you're going to miss out on the peer review assignment, which cannot be submitted late as per the syllabus. Overall, I hope you had a good weekend, and text or email me with specific assignment guidelines.